Kicker, and to an extent, multi-kicker, is an optional additional cost added onto cards. When this cost is paid, a card is considered kicked, and it gains an additional effect. It's an old and fairly underrepresented effect in Magic the Gathering, and it is also the focus of my personal favorite commander, Hallar the Firefletcher. Hallar gives a small bonus whenever you cast a kicked spell, getting a +1/+1 counter and then dealing damage to your opponents equal to the number of +1/+1 counters on them. My original deck list featured lots of kicker spells, and a bit of mana ramp to make sure I could cast the kicked version every time. The main strategy would be to get Hallar onto the battlefield, and then cast kicker spells once or twice per turn, slowly growing them into a game-ending threat. I had cards that added extra counters on top of the one from Hallar's ability, like Hardened Scales and Ozolith, or when I moved through my turn, like Ring of Valkas and Fight Rigging, and also cards that would draw me into more kicker spells whenever I dealt damage with Hallar, like Snake Umbra and Keen Sense. My original deck list was slow and clunky. I had a lot of kicker cards that were just too expensive, leading to many times where I drew a kicker spell and couldn't cast it. I also did not have enough effects to buff Hallar independently of casting kicked spells, meaning I pretty much solely relied on the lackluster kicker spells to do anything at all. On top of this, the deck ran too little protection, leaving my one and only win condition, Hallar, vulnerable after they reached a high enough number of counters to pose a threat. Because of this, I decided to flip the deck on its head, and create a list focused on putting an enormous volume of +1/+1 counters on Hallar, and then using kicker spells as pseudo-burn effects to finish off the game. This strategy is much faster, more consistent, and more fun to pilot than the mid-range ramp strategy that my previous iteration used. To accomplish this, I removed lots of the subpar or downright bad kicker spells that had taken up slots in the list. There are plenty of 5 or 6 mana kicker spells that I was better off without, especially when I could replace them with stronger effects that put counters directly onto Hallar. Many of these effects only put one +1/+1 counter on Hallar per turn, either on my upkeep, when I moved to combat, or when I attacked with Hallar. Some of the effects I added only put one counter onto Hallar when they or the effect entered the battlefield, while others had a limited number of times they could put counters onto Hallar. The most drastic addition I made was the +1/+1 counter doubling instants and sorceries. There are only 3 in the list, mainly because I wanted to avoid this effect being attached to permanents, and because I wanted to only use the versions of this effect that put a counter onto its targets first, due to the beneficial synergy with Hardened Scale effects, essentially putting 5 +1/+1 counters onto Hallar with no counters on it. With these changes, I transitioned the deck from a subpar mid-range list to a borderline combo burn deck, which puts tons of +1/+1 counters onto Hallar in one big burst before playing a few kicker spells to burn at the table. Because of this, many of the deck's most important cards are better off left in your hand, rather than on the field. Counter-doubling cards are one of these effects. Many Hallar lists run cards like Hydra's Growth, Court of Garenbrig, Invigorating Surge, and Visions of Dominance to double up on Hallar's counters, but I opted to forgo the permanent-based doubling effects in favor of the spell-based effects. My reason for this is available information. When you hold up a counter-doubling effect, and a few kicker spells, your opponents are not likely to realize that you can go for a win, or even threaten life totals at all, leading to them tapping out or using their interaction elsewhere. If your counter-doubling effect is visible on the battlefield, your opponents are much more likely to spend their resources removing it, or worse, removing Hallar. However, some similar effects in the deck do not follow this philosophy. Uncivil Unrest is a powerful card that doubles the damage dealt by creatures with +1/+1 counters, but is an enchantment that costs 5 mana. The benefit with Uncivil Unrest is that it is a static effect, meaning once the card resolves and you have priority again, you can simply cast a kicker spell to trigger Hallar's ability and deal massive amounts of damage. There are many other effects in the deck that are visible to our opponents, but most of these only put small amounts of counters onto Hallar at a time, making it much less likely for an opponent to notice how big of a threat Hallar is until it's too late. The deck is not all +1/+1 counters though, and is supported by a variety of ramp effects, a suite of removal, and protection pieces to ensure that Hallar sticks around to deal the finishing blow. Some of these effects can even put +1/+1 counters on Hallar, either because they are kicker cards, or just happen to do so. Protection spells are especially important to this list, since they help the deck to beat out targeted removal or board wipes, both of which are disastrous to our game plan. On top of the cards that I decided to include, there are a few interactions that seem like they would have little effect on the performance of this deck, but are actually incredibly important to its success. The first one is that kicker is an additional cost, meaning that even if you cast the spell for free, you can still pay its kicker cost to kick the spell. There are exactly 3 cards in the list that could cast spells for free, and each of them are excellent ways to cheat on the mana cost of kicker spells if you have nothing better to do. The second is that Hallar's ability is triggered upon casting the kicked spell. This means that even if the kicked spell does not resolve, you still get the damage from Hallar's ability. This allows us to chain together multiple instant speed kicker spells to put multiple triggers on the stack, even if our opponent has counterspells. The third and final interaction is that Hallar's ability does not care if Hallar is still on the field when it resolves. It will still deal damage equal to the number of +1/+1 counters on Hallar. I've linked a video by Judging for the Win down in the description, which explains this interaction in more detail, but all you need to know is that the ability checks how many counters were on Hallar when they were last on the field, even if he gets removed before the ability resolves. This deck is by far my most consistent and is a blast to play with. I hope this video inspires you to try it out and give it a shot. While my personal list is not very budget, I'll link a second version that is more affordable down in the description below. Feel free to modify the list to suit your taste, and have fun mastering the kicker technique. Thank you for watching.